Welcome to Wealth Well Done. Together, we'll cover a wide range of important topics surrounding money and the impact it has on our lives. From the sophisticated and highly valuable planning techniques of the ultra-wealthy to the commonly underutilized biblical teachings. Together, we'll work to improve our relationship with money and our effectiveness in stewarding it well. Here's your host, Eric Scovill.
All right. Welcome back to the Wealth Well Done podcast, where we share tactical, practical, and spiritual advice to help you do your wealth well done. This week, we are doing part 2 with Robert Ritzenthaler, the CEO of REM Capital. We started last week with Robert as we went into a bit of his history, lessons learned through the dot-com crash bubble, the '08 crash, and COVID. We got into a little bit of how he approaches investors and education, and what he's, how he approaches investing in general. So we're going to pick up this week right where we left off. But before we do that, disclaimer as always that, regardless of if someone has a license or not on this show, all of the advice that's given is meant to be, these are suggestions, these are not, this is not financial advice specific to any one person. So we always, request that you go and take this advice, bounce it off your own financial professional team to see if this makes sense for you before you do anything else with that. Please don't take this and run with it on your own without considering how this applies to you, because this is generic advice here. And also the same thing, I am in business with REM Capital. We have been so grateful to partner with Robert and REM because they're such a phenomenal team, but I don't want that to be hidden from anyone here as we get into this. All right. So Robert, picking back up where we left off before, we were talking about how do you keep your children from being entitled? And so,
so the ultimate question.
Yeah. So you have a large family. You have a big business. And it's not like you're not trying to blast yourself all over social media and you're not some major household name like Grant Cardone, but you are certainly out there enough that your children's friends can pick up on this, that their dad is a businessman and a successful one. So how do you raise your kids in that environment?
Yeah, it's interesting too, because I think even if you are a even more well-known figure like a Grant Cardone, I don't know that it's necessarily that much worse or better. I think there's a point at which it's pretty bad and it just is a challenge. I shouldn't say bad. That makes it sound like there's a negative to it. But it's a challenge, I think, if you really don't want your kids to grow up with that entitlement mentality.
Yeah.
One of the things that I appreciate about my dad, when I was growing up, he was a custom home builder in Dallas. We typically had the largest, nicest house in the entire town. And really, almost nobody knew about it because it just wasn't something that we talked about. We went home, friends went home, didn't think about it. My dad literally never talked about it. And it wasn't that he didn't talk about it because he was trying to be weird about it. It just was not it wasn't on his mind. It wasn't his value system. And that value system got translated to, I think, to a large degree through to us. I think if he would have talked about it, he would have talked, well, I love my house. I want to build a bigger house. I want to have a nice house. And we got the biggest house. Yeah, we would have picked up on that. Absolutely. All day long. Now, your kids, so you're going to pick up on that anyway. So
certainly,
that is the least that you can do, I think, as a parent, is to downplay, not in a weird way, not in a disingenuous way, but just, let your heart show through about what your values are. And so one of the things for me with our kids is we don't talk about the money. We don't talk about all the stuff. We try to downplay that. We try to keep our lives relatively grounded. In fact, the other day I was driving our 2009 minivan. It's got 240,000 miles on it. And I went to pick up one of our other partners, Adam, at the airport. And he just kind of looked at me like, dude, what are you doing in this car? And I said, Adam,
you have $500 million of assets that you manage right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I said, well, okay, I wouldn't necessarily pick up an investor in this car. So, there is some level of whatever. But I said, I really don't care. And it's almost good for me to remind myself where I came from. I didn't have a lot of money. I didn't need a lot of money. And money's not what's going to keep me here or sustain me. Now,
Right.
I'm thankful for the blessings that I have, and I hope to be a good steward of them. Absolutely. I feel like
Right.
I have a calling to use the talents and gifts that God has given me to benefit as many people as I possibly can, both, employees, investors, family, whatever it may be. But I think you can do little things like that just to kind of keep yourself in check. I also remember my dad, after I got my first, good job in New York City, 21 years old, 22, whatever it was, making six figures, which was a lot of money.
Yep.
And, I remember him saying, well, so you're going to get a new car? And I was like, I don't know. He's like, well, just think about what you're going to think as you walk to your car every day. And, people are going to see you go to your car, whatever. Think about how that's going to affect you. And I thought, okay, all right. So I went to the Porsche dealership. I looked at the Porsche. I went to the BMW. I looked at BMW. Went to the Mercedes dealership, and I thought, gosh, I could buy any of these cars.
Yep.
Ended up buying a $9,000 Dodge Stratus. And, nice car, and nothing wrong with it. But I just made the decision to pay cash for my car. Made the decision to get something that was a little simpler than what I needed. And I didn't have to. That wasn't the point. I didn't have this guilty feeling like, oh my gosh, if I get a Porsche, I'm a terrible person.
Right.
No, I just made a simple decision that I didn't want to be, I didn't want to allow my mind to get too far in that direction.
I think that says a lot about you. It says a lot about where your identity is not in material things and not in what people think of you, because he wears a fancy suit or he drives a fancy car, and therefore he must be special.
Right. And again, I always like to say this: there is nothing wrong with driving a nice car. Nothing wrong with having a nice house. Nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with it. So I think the key here is that each of us individually has to assess our own situation, our own heart, our own desire, and make critical decisions based on that. And so, for somebody else, they may not have kids. They may not, money may not be an issue, and they drive a Porsche, and it's no big deal. But for me, somebody who's highly ambitious, wants to be successful, always dreamed of, running a business, etc. I knew that was a weakness for me. And I wanted to make sure that if I ever did get into a position where I was running a big business, that my head wasn't turned into a complete mushball.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and I think that makes a lot of sense for you, but there's no doubt that translates into your children as well. So
yes, right. Well, that was my point. Is I think as you live that out as a parent, as a spouse, as a person, I think that comes through to your children. And usually, the decisions that you make for your children are a reflection of who you are as a person. And so I try to stay away from the, don't do this, do that, don't buy this, do this. And I always come back and say, well, look at yourself. What is your priority list? What are you striving for? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to achieve happiness for your children? Okay. What's that going to look like in 10 years, 20 years? If all you care about is their happiness. Happiness isn't happiness. We all know that.
Yep.
If you strive for happiness, you will not be happy. If you strive for character, if you strive for, telling the truth, if you strive for things that take a little bit of work, then you'll have happiness. And so I always try to go back to that. And, I think it's easy to come up with a to-do list. And again, nothing wrong with the to-do list. Certainly there's practical application to everything. But I think if we come back to the heart, usually what's in there comes out at some point, and it's reflected in our kids.
yeah, no. All right. Phenomenal points. Thank you for that. Okay. Switch gears. Macroeconomic climate.
Here we go.
we have an interesting situation on our hands right now.
Yeah.
And so what I want to do is get into some of the technical aspects here as you see, wage growth is good for multifamily.
Mm-hmm.
But now, as the Fed tries to tackle inflation, certainly wage growth is sticky. That is sticky inflation. The lumber prices go up. They certainly didn't go all the way back down, but lumber prices go up, they can come back down. Right. But when wage growth happens, that's something that's more sticky. And so if the Fed's trying to fight inflation, which obviously we all know what has happened to the employee market here over the last couple of years, and just how hot that's gotten, as they're trying to actively bring up unemployment, as a means of fighting inflation and as a key measurement for inflation. Where does that position a multifamily investor?
Sure. And there's a few different elements here that I think are important to keep in mind. Because I'm one of those, I guess you could say, oddball people where I actually strongly support wage growth because I believe that the middle, lower class parts of society need to have a living wage. And it bothers me when people are getting $10 an hour and you have to pay $1,000 a month in rent. It just doesn't work.
Right.
So, on the flip side, you can argue, well, everybody has a cell phone, everybody has a brand new TV, blah, blah, blah. Okay, sure, there's some truth to that too. But I think we've got to think about a living wage for people. So I support wage growth. I actually think the Fed supports wage growth. Some of the comments that they've made about the fact that wage growth has not kept up, not even close, kept up to the rest of the cost of living, I think is a fair point.
Yep.
Now, we don't want to cause mass inflation, to your point, because that can derail the entire economy. But I think there's some room in wage growth that they would allow. What we're seeing today, I think more than anything else, is a dichotomy between what the Fed is trying to do and what Congress is doing. I think that is our biggest headwind right now. Congress has initiated trillions of dollars of spending in the face of the Fed trying to fight inflation.
Right.
So I know it's not a politically correct topic, I guess you should say, to cut spending. But the fact is that spending is hurting the middle class and the lower class because it's causing inflation in places that we don't want it, which is then causing the Fed to raise interest rates, which is causing housing to go up and people can't afford a house. So I'm maybe a little bit counter, whatever you want to call it, mainstream in that respect. But I really believe if we fixed the spending problem that Congress has, I think a lot of these things would go away and we'd be able to allow the wage growth to continue at a reasonable pace and we wouldn't have all this issue. Now, to your question about multifamily, what does this do for us? Well, I think two things. One, if inflation continues, obviously the value of these assets continue to go up. So from an appreciation standpoint, we win. Rents continue to go up, which means profits are going to go up. We win. Obviously, we have to control our expenses. So, that's sort of the wild card is what happens to that. The biggest problem for us, the biggest risk always is when jobs are destroyed and people cannot pay their rent.
Right.
That's the biggest concern. If that goes away, we're in trouble. Now, we have about a $2 to $3 million shortage of multifamily units and about a $6 million shortage in single family units in the country. So theoretically, we'd have to see a severe drop in jobs before we get any major effect. So I don't think we're at a point where we're going to see that. But I do think that's always our biggest risk. If people lose their jobs, then we got a problem because we can't collect rent from people that don't have money. Right. That was the same thing with the pandemic. When the government said, hey, all you hospitality workers are out of a job tomorrow, it's like, whoa, wait a minute, guys. How does that work?
Right. So that comes into and we talked a little bit last episode about how you assess risk from a stress testing standpoint. Where do you take stress testing? And as you're looking at new properties that you're looking at purchasing now, or even how you're assessing you had mentioned, needing to do a pullback on some of, a reduction in the distributions that you're issuing. How are you assessing those stress tests?
Yeah, I mean, the stress tests are pretty much the same regardless of the market. There's a few things that we like to do that help. One is we've got 6 months of working capital reserve that we set aside. Number two is, we're not over leveraged, so that helps.
That's big. Those two are huge.
Yeah, absolutely. We can withstand a 80% occupancy and still be okay. Problem that we faced, for instance, last quarter, was that we had folks that stopped paying rent because of the end of COVID relief. So our delinquency went way up, which means our economic occupancy went way down, combined with interest rates going up. So we got some higher costs of borrowing, combined with inflation, where real estate taxes are up, insurance is up, payroll's up, everything else is up too.
Right.
So, and then it takes 12 months for us to turn an entire property from a leasing standpoint. So, all this happened in the course of maybe 3 to 6 months. And now we've got to take 12 months to catch up, which we will. But obviously, you feel that short-term pain as a multifamily operator when those things happen. So that's kind of where we're at today. But again, the market as a whole is healthy. The fundamentals of the business are strong. But you've got to have the fortitude and the operational capability, really, to make it through these kind of scenarios.
And for those who didn't listen to last week's episode where Robert went over risk, that he covered the fact that so much of the risk assessment is in the operator, and obviously operators who are going much more to the max on leverage and who are running a thinner balance sheet. Those operators are, I would say, they're in jeopardy right now.
Right. Yeah. Well, they're making capital calls. They're cutting distributions to zero. They're, probably in a situation where 6 months they might have to have a short sale to get out of a deal.
Yep.
All of those scenarios are beginning to play out around us. You're not going to hear about them because, who wants to raise their hand and say, "Hey, we're screwed."
Right.
But they're happening all around us right now. And so, I think one of my, not major concerns, but one of my somewhat concerns is that if that spreads to too many properties, then we could see a fairly significant decrease in the overall market. I don't think that's going to happen. There is just a ton of money sitting on the sidelines looking for a home, looking for an opportunity. Right. So I think that's going to prop up a lot of these operators, to their benefit, and that's fine. But I do think that'll happen. And, some people have said, well, what if the Fed drops rates tomorrow? Okay. Well, if the Fed drops rates, then most likely the dollar is not necessarily the reserve currency of choice. So we won't have as much foreign investment. But obviously the valuations of our existing properties is going to go back up because the cap rates are going to drop.
Yep.
Flip side, the interest rates keep going up. Fed fights inflation, shows the world that, hey, dollar's still the reserve currency of the world. Great. Everybody still wants to invest in the U.S. Lots of money sitting there ready to go when there's a distressed opportunity. So I think either way, we're going to come out all right from a commercial property standpoint.
Okay. So that brings into, so I wanted to hit a little bit on how you switch investing between, if you're investing in a rising interest rate environment versus a declining interest rate environment.
Yep. Yeah, well, I'll just say this, big picture. I'm not a market timer. So I've never tried to sell at the top, buy at the bottom, nothing like that. I'm not smart enough to do that. Some guys
or smart enough not to do it.
Maybe. I do think there's guys out there that are. I know there's guys out there that are smarter than I, so they can time some of that. Hey, kudos to them.
Sure.
I don't feel like I'm smart enough to do that. I look at the data and I try to make reasonable decisions based on what I see today with some reasonable expectations of the future. So for me, it's more about being careful when you're in a rising interest rate environment. Your ability to adjust is going to be slower than typically it's going to be slower than what's happening in the market. So again, going back to last quarter, expenses go up faster than I can turn the property. It takes 12 months to turn a property. Now, thankfully, we're not in the office space market where it takes 5 years to turn a lease. So we're better than that, but still it's 12 months. So in a rising interest rate environment, you have to be prepared from a liquidity standpoint. Now, from an appreciation standpoint, as I mentioned, long-term property is appreciating. You're not going to feel it in the short run, but it's appreciating. On the flip side, when the interest rates are going down, you're going to be able to capture a lot of that upside. But the danger is that it lulls you into what I would call operational sort of mud, where you don't have to perform really well on the operational side, and you're going to make money every single time because you're just buy it, hold it, flip it, buy it, hold it, flip it. And so you can get a little lazy on the operational side.
Right.
And that's where, we're taking the opportunity in 2023 to really tighten down our operations, really bring on the right people, build out the bench. And it's good. We should do it anyway. But it's kind of nice to have an opportunity where the market's a little bit slower. So.
All right. So now let's take a minute. So you have As you look out at the landscape of where you're at for 2023, where REM Capital is looking to invest, you are making a shift into development instead of value add.
Yep.
We hit a little bit on what you're seeing as an opportunity inside development right now, and then after that, kind of roll into the property that you are. Full permission for a shameless plug here to talk a little bit about St. Pete, just from the standpoint that you're not trying to con anyone into this, but I want people to understand what REM does and why you think that this opportunity in St. Pete is unique.
Sure, yeah, and I do think there's an absolute business case for what we're doing. We had several deals under contract last year. First half of the year, we put them under contract. We closed them all at the end of the year, renegotiated most of them 3-4 times, got a nice discount as their interest rates went up. We decided to stick with those deals in part because, we put them under contract and we tend to be people of our word. So, hey, if we're buying your property, we're buying your property. But we got a discount, felt like it was a good deal. That being said, we have not put any value add deals under contract since about mid of last year. So basically, Fed started raising rates and we said, hey, hang on. How does this look from a today standpoint? So again, timing the market, I probably would have shut it off at the beginning of last year, but I'm not a market timer. So I'm looking at deals in January, February. I'm thinking, hey, maybe rates go up a little bit. Deal's still fine. We'll close it. And then rates start going up. You go back to seller, you renegotiate, life goes on. And I do think it was worth closing it because we'll spend an extra $1 million on interest, but we got a $5 to $7 million discount on the valuation. So,
sure.
I'll take a 5x multiple on my money all day long.
Absolutely. As will your investors.
Exactly. So I think kind of switching gears though, from a development standpoint, so development has a longer pipeline. So you buy a piece of property and you're 2 to 3 years out before that product hits the market. So in the meantime, you're playing a little bit more market timing because you don't know what's going to happen in 2 to 3 years. So for me, it was an opportunity for us to, we came across some land, several pieces of land, 2 of these in St. Petersburg that we just felt were a good deal, great opportunity. And typically what happens in an economic downturn is that new construction starts tank. People get scared, don't want to do development. And so new construction really start to tank. What that means is that 2 years later, year to 2 years later, there's not very many new starts. So from an inventory absorption standpoint, you're in pretty good shape.
Right.
Now people would argue, well, yeah, but by then the economy's weak. And so, the demand isn't as high. That's true. You're definitely taking a risk. But at the same time, 2 to 3 years later, the economy comes back and there's minimal inventory. Watch out. Now you really have a good deal.
Yeah. Okay.
So if you can underwrite a deal conservatively with current metrics, do a little stress testing and it works, you're basically giving yourself huge upside potential with a 2-year window. And I love that opportunity right now because it gives us the ability to put our foot in the ground, get some great product out of the dirt. And in 2 years, we're going to be ready to lease it up. So that kind of leads to where we're at with St. Pete. Great market, core market, huge growth, hasn't seen any rent decreases since the beginning of the interest rate increase. Valuations continue to go up. Incomes, population, everything continues to go up. Great market.
Yeah. Right.
Would want to be there anyway. And I feel like we have a little bit of an opportunity because not as many people are in the market vying for these new development sites. And so look at us, little REM, boom. We're going to have 220 units coming out of the ground in downtown St. Pete, Florida. Pretty cool.
Yeah,
I'm excited.
Absolutely.
But that's kind of the thought process there. It's an opportunity to get a 2-year window with a great upside potential on a core A+ location in a great market. I think it's well worth the investment opportunity.
So maybe explain to investors a little bit of why you chose to go with studio apartments there and what your thought is behind that.
Yep. Yeah, we've had a lot of questions about the unit mix because we went with the smaller unit sizes. And I would say, I wouldn't necessarily do this in every single market. I live here in the Tampa Bay area, so I know this market really well. So if you're going to make a bet on your market, you better know your market really well. Let me just say that.
Sure. That's a great point.
Again, don't do this at home type of thing. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm guaranteed to win, but I'm making a little bit of a bet because I believe, based on the statistics and from the knowledge that I have of this market, there are a lot of people who would love to be in downtown St. Petersburg, but cannot afford a $3,000 to $4,000 per month rent. They're okay with the smaller unit. They don't mind that. Some of them are working from home, some are not, but their life, their living is not in their apartment. They're living in downtown St. Pete. It's beautiful. It's sunny. It's gorgeous. It's great community. It's restaurants. It's art. It's music. I mean, it's amazing. You don't want to be in your apartment anyway. So if you can get into the location for, 50 to 60% less than what you could otherwise, I think we're going to provide a very unique value proposition to those residents. And that's what I'm excited about. So that's really the crux of why we did that. The other side of it is that it's lower risk, I think. So building units at, let's call it $500,000 per unit, just basis wise, it's more risk. We've got a neighbor going up catty corner to us, 200 units, $94 million to put that property in the ground. We're doing 220 units for, call it 50 million. So almost double the price per unit. So again, your basis is no guaranteed of success. Right. Not saying that, but it certainly reduces that risk over the long run.
Absolutely.
So those are kind of our two reasons, I guess, for why we chose that unit mix.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Last question there. If you had to assess, so obviously Florida got hit hard in 2008. How is Florida positioned now? And I'm not saying that we're going to have some major real estate crash here now, but there's certainly, we're on shaky ground, and it just depends on where the Fed goes. And I think the Fed is, you alluded to this a little bit, but they're in a bit of a no-win situation as they stand. So as they try to choose the lesser of two evils, or the lesser of five evils, it might be the better way to look at it. If someone is trying to assess real estate, whether this is an investment in St. Pete or a condo in downtown Miami, how is Florida positioned today compared to 2008?
Sure. I think there's a couple of very important factors that have changed since 2008. Number one, the amount of leveraged empty properties is drastically less than what it was in 2008. Okay. So got a lot of properties that are owned in cash, that even investment properties owned in cash, Blackstone being one of the largest investors. Yeah. So you're not in a situation where people have no money in these houses. That's not the current scenario. And that changes a lot of things. The other interesting scenario, as you know, is that because interest rates have risen, people are not able to sell their homes. They're kind of stuck. Right. And, we're back in 2007, 2008, people had no equity. They were way upside down. They're not upside down. Housing prices have, stabilized, but they still got equity. There's no reason for people to move out. There's no reason for them to throw the keys and say, screw it, I'm out. So they're sitting tight. And that helps a market like this. It helps stabilize things. So I don't think that we're going to see the same scenario for those two reasons. I also believe that because of 2008, banks were required to be a little bit more careful with their lending. And I think that's helped the overall market in general. Now, obviously we have the situations like Silicon Valley and Signature Bank, but you really have to dig into the reasons for why those particular bank failures happened. And it was related to bad investment decisions, not because they were over leveraged from a real estate standpoint. And that's, a few weeks ago, I did a CEO blog on that because I really wanted people to understand, guys, listen, you can invest in treasuries, which Silicon Valley did. They invested in treasuries. Hey, we don't want to risk this. We're just going to put it in treasuries, get our 2, 3, 4%, whatever it is. It sounds really smart. But as interest rates go up, the value of those bonds go down. And man, did the value of those bonds go down. Ouch.
Right.
So, what are you left with? Well, you made 4%, you lost 30. Last time I checked, 30 minus 4, or 4 minus 30, I'm upside down 26. That's not good.
That's enough to collapse the bank.
Right. So, I think it's important to always think these things through from a practical standpoint and not just soundbite standpoint.
Right. So what would you say what would you say to someone, and maybe we'll keep this one short here. What would you say to someone who's trying to assess, they're trying to assess the time to invest, and when do they continue sitting on the sidelines in cash or in some ultra, short-term bond portfolio, or do they look at being a little bit more opportunistic inside real estate now?
Sure. Yeah. Well, my answer is pretty much the same regardless of the market, honestly. And again, people could disagree with me and say, that's ridiculous. It's basically the same thing. I told people the same thing 5 years ago. I said, listen, you got some money to invest, get it invested. Save a little on the sidelines, diversify your investments, but get it invested. If you invest with a good operator in a good asset class over the long run, you're going to do just fine. And if you look at Warren Buffett, basically, that's his model. And the guy's done all right.
he has absolutely done all right.
So,
all right, Robert, how do investors find you? How do they get a hold of your CEO blog to start consuming your content, which is what I would recommend anyone does to just get a more educational approach to this, to understand a little bit more about REM, especially about Robert and your thought process behind investing. So how do investors find you to invest, or to or even just to start consuming your content?
Yeah, well, I always say go to the front door, remcapital.com. We've got a link on there to get on our email list, and the contact form. You can always reach out to me, but that's the best way. And like you mentioned too, we got a YouTube channel, LinkedIn, all the usual stuff too. So,
okay, well, It has been an absolute pleasure. It's always I learn a ton every time I talk to you, so I appreciate it. I hope the listeners got a lot out of these last two episodes as well. So, Robert, thank you very much for your time. Thanks for joining us here. And for the listeners, if next week we are going to be meeting with Cal Rickner, and we're going to be working on stewardship and how to settle the issue of ownership. So, hope you'll join us again next week. Robert, thank you very much.
You bet. My pleasure.
Thank you again for listening to Wealth Well Done. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player, and together we'll continue to improve our relationship with money and our effectiveness in stewarding it well.